Amos Bellamy had lived on that ridge for 60 years, and in all that time the owls had called from the hollows below it, never from the ridge itself. Then, for one night in October of 1913, they came up onto the ridge all at once. By the next morning, Amos Bellamy was gone. He left 32 acres, 6 head of cattle, 2 horses he didn't even stop to lead out of the barn, a house full of furniture he'd built with his own hands. He carried 1 canvas bag down the mountain and never spent another night on that ridge again. A neighbor met him on the road below and asked what had happened. Amos looked back once, toward the timberline. "It's theirs now," he said. "What is?" "The ridge." He didn't explain further. He never would, not in the 15 years he had left to live. But the people who knew him, who'd known him and Lydia both, who'd watched him work that ground for 6 decades, understood one thing without needing it spelled out. Amos Bellamy was not a man who scared easily, and not a man who gave things up. Something had happened on that ridge worth walking away from everything he owned. Locally, people came to call it the night the owls took the ridge. Nobody who said it meant it literally, not at first. To understand why a man like that would leave, you have to understand why he'd stayed so long in the first place. Amos and Lydia built the house together when they were young, hauling lumber up switchbacks with a mule team, clearing the fields themselves 1 stump at a time. They planted the orchard the spring after their son was born. Lydia wanted a porch that faced west, so Amos built her one, and every evening for 30 years she sat in the same cane-backed chair, facing west, watching the light go down over the hollows. He built her kitchen shelves crooked, and she teased him about it until the day she died, and he never fixed them. They raised 1 son on that ground, a boy who grew up doing chores before school, and helping his father clear new ground every spring, until he was old enough to want a life that didn't smell like turned earth and wood smoke. He went west in his early 20s, the way plenty of sons did in those years, chasing rail work and then a homestead claim of his own, and the letters home grew shorter and further apart the longer he was gone. Amos never held it against him. He and Lydia had raised him to be the kind of man who went and found his own ground, and that was exactly what he'd done. Lydia got sick a few winters before the owls came, a long illness that took the better part of 2 years to finish its work. Amos nursed her through most of it himself, carrying water up from the well long after his own back had given him reason to stop, sitting up through the worst nights in a chair he'd pulled beside the bed. When she died, in the room they'd shared for 3 decades, the whole valley expected him to sell. A widower with no wife and a grown son gone west didn't need 32 acres of hillside farm, and everyone said so kindly enough in the weeks after the funeral. His son wrote asking him to come live closer, somewhere flatter, somewhere easier on an old man alone. Amos wrote back and told him no. A neighbor asked him once, not unkindly, why he stayed on alone. "She's still everywhere I look," Amos said. He didn't mean it as anything strange. He meant the orchard she'd planted, the porch she'd wanted, the crooked shelves. He meant that leaving the ridge would mean leaving the last place Lydia Bellamy had ever been, and he wasn't willing to do that, not for comfort, not for company, not for anything. That's what makes what happened next worth telling. It would take something enormous to move a man like that. The first owl showed up in late summer, sitting on a fence post outside the barn in broad daylight. Not unheard of, but unusual enough that Amos noticed it and mentioned it in passing to a hand who helped him with the hay. By the next morning it was gone. A few nights later he heard one calling from down toward the creek, the low back-and-forth cadence every Ozark farmer knew by heart. Then 2 calling across the ridge to each other. Amos didn't think much of it. He'd lived around owls his whole life. Barred owls nested in the hollow timber every year, and a man who farmed that ground long enough learned to sleep through their calling the way he slept through wind in the trees. But they kept coming closer to the house. One landed on the barn roof. One took to sitting near Lydia's old orchard, on the low branch of the apple tree she'd planted the year their son was born. One perched on the frame of the well most evenings, watching the yard without moving. They didn't attack anything. They didn't take chickens or bother the stock. They just watched. and there were more of them every week, and Amos found himself standing at his own window some nights, counting shapes in the dark. He asked a hand who'd trapped that country for 20 years whether he'd ever seen owls behave this way. The trapper said no, but his own father used to say the ridge had a way of filling up every so often, though nobody could remember it actually happening. Amos wrote it off as old men's talk and went back to the hay. Years before, when Lydia was still healthy, she'd told Amos something her grandmother used to say. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a curse. It was just an old mountain saying, the kind every family up in those hollows seemed to carry one version of. If the owls ever stop calling from the hollows and start calling from the ridge, Lydia had told him, laughing a little at how strange it sounded out loud, don't stay to hear the last one. Amos had laughed too, at the time. Old superstition, nothing more. Her grandmother had been full of them. Weather sayings, planting sayings, sayings about crows, and about wells running dry. Nobody put much stock in any of it. But by September, Amos found himself thinking about that saying more than he wanted to admit, because the pattern Lydia had described was happening in front of him. The calling in the hollows below the ridge had gone quieter than he'd ever known it, and on the ridge itself, where owls had never gathered before in 60 years of his life there, the calling had gotten steady enough that he could set a clock by it. 1 became 3. 3 became something closer to 7. A neighbor walking the fence road at dusk one evening counted what he guessed were a dozen owls strung along Amos's property line, different sizes, mostly barred but at least one great horned among them, sitting close enough together that it didn't look like ordinary roosting behavior to anyone who saw it. Word got around the valley. People started finding reasons to drive past the Bellamy place around sundown, just to look, slowing their wagons at the bottom of the ridge road and craning to count fence posts the way they might have counted cars at a wreck. Nobody stopped to ask Amos about it directly. A man's business was his own, even when half the valley had started talking about it over supper. Amos stopped sleeping well. He told himself it was nerves, or grief working itself loose after all those years, or nothing at all. He kept working the farm through it, because that was what he knew how to do. He mentioned it to almost no one. A man his age, alone on a ridge, telling people he was losing sleep over birds. He knew how that would sound, and he wasn't ready yet to sound like a man whose mind had started slipping. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. New stories every week, waiting at the trailhead. It was around then, going through an old chest looking for extra blankets, that he found Lydia's notebook. Most of it was exactly what he expected: planting dates, recipes, a running account of eggs sold and flour bought, the ordinary bookkeeping of a farm wife's years. He almost put it back without reading further. Then he found an entry from long before they'd married, when Lydia was still a girl living with her grandmother down in the hollow. She'd written about a night the owls had come up out of the hollows all at once, the whole family sleeping somewhere lower on the mountain until it passed. Beneath that single entry, in her careful hand, she'd added one line and nothing else. Grandmother says they did this once before. No explanation followed. No later entry returned to it. Amos searched every page after that one and found nothing more, just eggs and flour and the ordinary weather of ordinary years, as if she'd written it down once and never let herself think about it again. Somehow that made it worse than if she'd explained everything. He sat with the notebook a long while that night, in the house he'd built her, and didn't sleep at all. The next morning he walked the orchard the way Lydia used to, slow, stopping at each tree like she'd stopped to check the fruit. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He told himself he was checking for frost damage on the young trees, though it was too early yet in the season for that to matter. What he was really doing, he'd admit years later to no one but himself, was trying to feel whatever it was Lydia had felt standing in that same spot as a girl, listening to a sound her own grandmother had once told her to be afraid of. By October, the numbers on the ridge had grown past anything a man could count accurately in the dark. Owls on the barn roof, owls strung along every fence post, owls in the orchard, in the trees along the drive, close enough now that Amos could hear wings shifting through the walls of his own house after dark. Then one evening, they stopped calling. For weeks the ridge had been full of sound, that steady back-and-forth cadence rolling across the property every night until it felt almost ordinary. Now, with more birds sitting on his land than he'd ever seen gathered anywhere, not one of them made a sound. Amos stood on the porch a long time in the last gray light, watching shapes settle onto the fence rail without a single call between them, and he thought of Lydia's grandmother's saying the way a man thinks of something he spent months trying not to think about. "Don't stay to hear the last one." He went inside. He locked the door, which he had almost never done in 60 years on that ridge, and he sat up fully dressed with Lydia's notebook in his lap, and he waited. Hours passed with no wind and no ordinary night sounds at all. Even the horses in the barn had gone restless and silent, shifting their weight without stamping, the way animals do when something has their attention that a man can't see. Amos sat in the dark kitchen with a lamp he didn't light, listening to a house that had never once in 60 years felt unfamiliar to him. He thought about Lydia on the porch at dusk. He thought about the orchard, the crooked shelves, every ordinary evening he'd taken for granted because he'd assumed there would always be another one. He did not think, even then, that anything was going to hurt him. That wasn't the fear sitting in his chest. It was something closer to the feeling of being asked to leave a room before you're ready, and knowing the asking wasn't really a question. Then, sometime after midnight, one owl called from somewhere close outside the house. Not dozens, one. Amos didn't go to the window. He never told anyone why, only that he'd decided beforehand he wouldn't look, and he held to it. What broke him wasn't anything at the glass. It was the horses, both of them pulling hard against their stalls, and the cattle crowding the far fence line as far from the house as the fencing would let them get, every animal on the property trying with everything it had to put distance between itself and that ridge. Then, from farther down the mountain, another owl answered. Then one farther than that. The calling began moving away from the house, ridge to hollow, hollow to the next hollow over, until within a few minutes the whole dark mountainside seemed to come apart in wings, what sounded to Amos like hundreds of birds lifting off at once, moving down and away into the timber. And then nothing, no calling, no wings, no sound at all the way until first light. Amos didn't wait for morning to feel comfortable before he moved. He packed one canvas bag by the gray light before sunrise, Lydia's photograph, her notebook, a change of clothes, what little cash he kept in the house. He left the livestock. He left the furniture he'd built and the crooked shelves and 32 acres he'd cleared by hand, because whatever he'd decided about that ridge in the dark hours of the night, he wasn't willing to spend one more hour on it to save any of it. On his way out he passed Lydia's chair, still sitting on the west-facing porch where it had sat for 30 years. It wasn't overturned, it wasn't broken, it had simply been turned around, so that instead of facing west toward the hollows the way it always had, it now faced the house. Amos stopped, looked at it a moment. He didn't touch it, and he didn't try to explain it to himself. He just walked past it and kept going. He was already on the road below when his neighbor found him, which is where this story started. It's theirs now, the ridge. What happened after is, in its way, just as strange as the night itself. Amos moved in with relatives several counties off and lived there 15 more years. People knew exactly where to find him. They visited. They asked, more than once, what he thought had really happened up there, and he never gave them an answer beyond what he'd already said. He wouldn't go back, not even when someone offered to drive him up to collect Lydia's belongings himself, the photographs and letters and small things a man usually can't bear to leave behind. No, he'd say, and nothing more, and after a while people stopped asking that particular question and settled for the others he was willing to answer, how the weather was faring him, whether his hips still bothered him in the cold, ordinary things. When a buyer eventually came along, Amos sold the place for far less than it was worth, and never asked a single question about the sale. He didn't ask who was buying it, or why, or whether they had children who'd be sleeping in the rooms he and Lydia had shared. A cousin who handled the paperwork said Amos signed where he was told to sign, and handed the pen back without reading past the first page. The man who had once told a neighbor that Lydia was still everywhere he looked on that ridge would not, for the rest of his life, look at it again. He kept her photograph on a dresser, in whatever room he was given, and he kept her notebook in a drawer beneath it, and as far as anyone knew, he never opened it again either. A younger family bought the farm not long after. This part matters because nothing happened to them. No owls gathered, no trouble came. They worked that ground successfully for decades, raised children there, sold eggs and hay, and lived about as ordinary a life as any family in that valley. Over time, most people settled on the simplest explanation, that grief had gotten the better of an old man alone on a ridge too full of memory, and that whatever he thought he'd seen or heard, it had lived mostly in his own exhausted mind. The story faded the way most old stories do, told less often, told shorter, until the children who'd grown up hearing about the night the owls took the ridge were the ones telling it to their own children as something that happened a long time ago, to somebody's grandfather, maybe. Then, close to 40 years later, a different family living on that same ground had a daughter who noticed an owl sitting on the barn roof one September evening. Then another. Within a few weeks, the ridge was filling again the way it had for Amos Bellamy decades before. Somebody remembered his name. Not everyone at first. The story had thinned out enough over 40 years that most of the valley's younger families knew only the shape of it. A widower who'd abandoned his farm one morning and refused to set foot on the ridge again, the kind of tale that gets told at gatherings without anyone quite vouching for the details. But there were still a handful of old people who remembered Amos Bellamy himself, who'd sat with him in the years after, who'd heard him say, "It's theirs now," with their own ears. Word passed around the valley the way it does, and an elderly neighbor who'd known Amos in his last years and who still remembered the sale, went and found the new family and told them something that had never made it into any of the retellings. "You don't have to believe him," the neighbor said. "Just don't sleep up there when they go quiet." Around the same time, renovations on the old house turned up a letter tucked behind a wall, written decades before Amos and Lydia had ever married. Most of it was ordinary family correspondence, the kind that survives in old houses by accident. But one paragraph, in a hand nobody living could place with certainty, mentioned an earlier gathering of its own. "The owls have come up from the hollows again," it read. "Your grandfather says we will sleep below the ridge until they go." That letter is the piece that changed how people in the valley talk about the story now, because it meant this hadn't started with Amos. Lydia's grandmother had seen a version of it. Lydia herself, as a girl, had seen a smaller one. Amos had seen the largest gathering anyone could remember. And now, 4 decades after he walked off that mountain with one bag and never came back, it was happening again to a family who'd never heard of him until a neighbor knocked on their door. Whatever this was, it had never really been about Amos Bellamy at all. The new family didn't leave the farm for good, but they took the old neighbor's advice on faith, and for several nights that October they slept down in the valley instead, close enough that people below could still hear the owls calling steadily across the ridge each evening. Then one night the calling stopped. Nobody went up to see why. The family came back the next morning to a farm with nothing damaged, nothing missing, nothing out of place at all, no explanation waiting for them, the way there'd been none for Amos. People still asked, sometimes, what Amos Bellamy thought would have happened if he'd stayed that last night. He never told anyone, not in 15 years of being asked. Maybe nothing would have. The families who farmed that ridge since have certainly proved it can be lived on without harm, season after season, decade after decade, most years without an owl doing anything stranger than an owl usually does. But the old people below Bellamy Ridge still pass along one piece of advice, the same one a grandmother gave a girl long before any of this had a name. If the owls are calling, leave them be. It's when they go quiet, all at once, that you come down from the ridge before the last one calls. 5.